Of all the engines in Kerbal Space Program, the Spark engine has always been one of my least used. This thing has very little power, and it has to be mounted on the bottom of something, meaning I can't just easily stack 100 of them to make up for that. In this video though, I want to try using only them to land on every moon of Jool without mining. And of course on the launch pad here, you can see this thing is nowhere near enough to get off the ground. But what I can do here is add an engine plate and add 9 attachment nodes to it. With that, I added on 9 Spark engines, and I wanted to give this another test. Now, while this wasn't too bad getting off the ground, it's also realistically the limit of how many engines I can use, so I'm kind of weight limited. Now, next up, I wanted to add on 1 more fuel tank, and the reason for that is at first, my plan was to have this lander go on Tylo and come back. Now, Tylo's the most massive moon in the Jool system, and it's probably the hardest to land on. And while this rocket wasn't too bad, I thought there's probably more efficient ways to do this, and you can see next, I deleted off my engines, and I'm putting them on the first stage. Trying this out, though, it seemed to just heat up and not really get me anywhere. So next up here, I pushed it further away and I wanted to try this again. This time, it seemed to heat up a bit slower, but it still wasn't getting me off the ground, and I realized that this design just wasn't gonna work. Instead though, what I wanted to try doing was using a larger fuel tank on top and giving myself a bigger lander. Now this should let me easily visit a few of the smaller moons, and I threw back on my engines. Now with that done, you can see I'm adding on some docking ports, and the reason for that is now I'm adding on some more fuel tanks. Now these fuel tanks will specifically help me when I'm trying to get to Tylo, and I'm able to drop them off once I finish landing on the ground. And after fitting on some landing gear and stuff here, I'm trying it out on the launch pad, and it seems to be okay. It's a little limited in thrust, which I wasn't super happy about, but this also did have over 4,000 meters per second to delta V, which should be enough to land on Tylo and get back into orbit. And you can see here, once I get up high enough, I'm able to drop them off easily enough, so this design should work well. So with the lander designed up here, you can see I added on a fairing, and I'm encapsulating this entire thing. This will make it a little more aerodynamic, and with that, it's time to figure out how to get it into orbit. My first idea here was to stack engine plates on engine plates, and you can see just how many engines I have. Now, the fuel tank I added was also extremely heavy, so I was pretty worried it wasn't gonna lift it, and that seemed to be true because it wasn't getting anywhere. Now, first, you can see here, I lowered the weight of the fuel tank, and after I did that, I started stacking more of these engines right in the center. These were badly clipping into each other, but at the very least, it did seem to work, but the lag was already getting pretty rough. Now, there was still a few things to add, and firstly, I added in a fuel tank on top, and this is going to be for refueling the lander so I can land on all the moons. After that, you can see here, I wanted to add on more of these fuel tanks on the side, sort of as a booster, but just trying to put these on here, my game nearly crashed, and I was pretty concerned about that. Now, because of that, I actually decided to attach these on the bottom of the rocket. This means that once I drop them off, they'll have almost no chance of destroying the main rocket here. So with that done, it's time to try it out on the launch pad here, and it was so badly laggy. This is almost unplayable, and once I launched the engines, it pretty much was impossible to figure out what was going on. Now, I'm pretty sure I sped this up by 16 times, and you can see here, the whole rocket's kind of starting to fall apart. This is when I realized I pretty much had no choice but to attach these right on the rocket. With 2 of these, I wanted to see if it could get off the ground, but unfortunately, it just didn't have the thrust, and the lag was still painful. Once I saw this, I knew I was gonna need to help this out a bit, so I added on 1 extra fuel tank. You also see here, I'm deleting off some of the boosters from the top stage. After that, I added on some parachutes here, and it's because instead of starting my landing on Tylo, my plan is to now end my landing on Tylo. This should save me a bit of fuel, and the parachute is gonna be for landing on Lave, which previously was going to be the last thing I did. And after that, you see here, I'm using some smaller boosters in the bottom, and once I got 8 of those on here, I wanted to give this a test. And trying to get this off the launch pad here, it was very laggy, but it wasn't honestly that bad, and with that small reduction in weight on top, it seemed to help out quite a bit. Now, you'll also see here, I'm deleting off 1 of the fuel tanks I had, and that was originally for refueling the little ship, but I was planning on just refueling it off of my main fuel tanks here, and you can see I'm actually changing those out now. I tried to calculate this so I'd have about 10% extra fuel than what I would need, and with everything in place here, I actually switched my launch site and wanted to give this a test. Now, this launch site is pretty close to the equator still, but the difference is it starts out almost a kilometer above sea level. This means that my engines are going to be more efficient, and also, since I'm starting higher up, it should be easier to get into space. So I fired off my engines here, and started to give this a test. This is very sped up footage, and the lag was extremely bad most of the time, and you can see that here. In fact, at this point, the game totally just crashed on me, and I had to try again. Now, I was pretty sure why it crashed last time, because I think I accidentally clicked out of the game. This time, though, things seem to be going quite a bit better, and I started to do my ascent. Now, I had noticed here I kind of forgot fins, but without them, it still seemed to be working out fine, and you can see now I got my apoapsis above 80,000 meters. Now, ordinarily, I would just consider launching straight away from Kerbin, but I did want to get a couple flybys off the moon to gain a little bit of speed. And after warping up to the top of my trajectory here, you can see I'm starting to do a burn to fully circularize. And during this burn, I ran out of fuel on my boosters here, and I started to drop them off. This should finally save me from the lag, because all of those engines are pretty much just causing the problem. But you can see now, continuing my burn out here, and I finally got my periapsis above 70,000 meters, meaning I'm fully in orbit. Now, I reloaded the save here just to get rid of the lag, and it was considerably better already. And with that done, it's time to extend out my orbit to the moon. Now, I was planning on doing 2 flybys of the moon. The first one is to get me a much larger orbit, and the second one was to fully fling me away. Doing this maneuver in 2 parts should allow me to gain more energy from the moon than I could gain in one. And after getting that encounter here, I started to plan it out, and you can see I'm going right around the moon's surface. And at that plan, you can see I'm warping around Kerbin again, and starting to face in the right direction. And finally here, you can see I'm getting my orbit. And I pushed it out, and I got it here to be 3,318 meters above the moon. This was not a lot, and I was a little concerned I'd pulled it in too close. And zooming in on the moon a bit closer, I could see here my trajectory line was going through the surface. This almost certainly meant I was gonna hit it, but I wanted to give it a try anyway, and unsurprisingly, yeah, it didn't go so well. So one more try here, I pushed it out to 7,000 meters, which was definitely safe. And with that done, I did my exact same encounter again. This time, you can see I'm coasting above 3,000 meters over the surface, and after that, it was time to get my second encounter. And you can see this one is gonna fling me way out, and after finishing up that burn here, I got everything set up, and I started to warp towards the moon. And with that flyby done, I'm finally in the sun's sphere of influence. This is the part where it gets interesting, because I could burn and just get all the way to Jool, but instead here you can see I'm waiting for another Kerbin encounter. This is so I can push out my orbit a little bit more, and by doing this over and over again, I should save a ton of fuel. So with that flyby done here, you can see extended out my orbit a tiny bit, I'm starting to get over towards Duna. That's ultimately my next target, because Duna should allow me to fling myself out all the way to Jool. And you can see now, planning out my second maneuver here, and warping around now. Now I was getting super close to Duna with just a few more flybys. I finally got all the way out there. It was time to start doing a flyby of Duna. This took a little while to find an encounter, but once I got that here, I set it up, and I was hoping to warp just around the atmosphere. I could see here that this was going to be quite efficient to do, and with Duna in the distance here, I started to do my flyby. Now, this wasn't too bad at all, and it was pretty much just rinse and repeat like 8 more times. Duna is not that massive, meaning that it takes a lot more flybys to fully fling yourself out, but after quite a bit more work here, I was pretty close to Jool. Now, I used a maneuver node to push myself out a bit more to touch Jool, and it was only going to cost me 200 meters per second. Now, I could have saved this fuel, but I was already actually doing pretty well, so I wanted to speed this process up a bit and start to do my burn. And with that done, I actually already had a Jool encounter, so I pulled myself in so I'd be right in the Jool system. I am doing something slightly different than usual, though, and you'll see I'm going for a Tylo encounter. Now, someone suggested that I try this, and it seemed like a very good idea. By getting a Tylo encounter, I'm able to pull myself into the Jool system using no fuel at all. This should be crazy efficient here, and you can see now I planned out my encounter with Jool and got myself in right at the beginning of that encounter. Now, once I was roughly in that spot, I used another maneuver node and started to get myself to warp around Tylo. I could see already this was totally working, so it was gonna fling me into Jool. So I pushed it out a bit further, and now my orbit did not look bad at all. So I did a quick burn to save that orbit here, and you can see after that, I started to warp in towards Jool and Tylo. With that Tylo encounter done here, I was finally in the Jool system, and it was time to start landing on some moons. Already though, I had a slight encounter with Lathe that I really didn't want to see, but fortunately I was able to quickly avoid that, but that kind of stuff is going to be a problem in the future. But now, finally in Jool's sphere of influence, it's time to undock my lander ship here and start on my first 2 targets. Now, I wanted to start out by landing on Pole and then on Bob. Now, the reason for that is that these 2 are the lightest moons, meaning that I should be able to land on both of them pretty comfortably. Now, I started out here with a quick assist off of Lathe, and you can see that in the distance here, and once I warped around it, I extended on my orbit quite a bit. Now I did a very small burn to get myself lined up with Pole here, and with that, I finally got an encounter. Now I started to pull in my orbit here, and I was going for a very close scrape. I knew I was going to be going past it pretty fast here, so I was a little concerned about fuel, but at this point, I had over 3,500 meters per second in my tank, and I was hoping that was going to be enough to get me on both moons. And now warping towards Bop here, I underestimated just how fast I was going, and I seemed to just slam right into the surface. So I went ahead here, gave this another try, and this time I started slowing down much earlier. With that done, I started to slowly make my way towards the surface, and fortunately here, I did seem to be landing on a fairly flat area. Unfortunately though, my landing gear went straight through the terrain, and I'm really not sure why it did that. I tried again here in a different spot, and you can see now I even slowed down a bit, but I still just went straight through the terrain, and it seemed to land fine, but it was just really bizarre. With it at least seemingly sort of landed, I decided to EVA my Kerbal here and plant the flag. This was where things got weirder though, because once I planted that flag, it just wasn't in front of the Kerbal. At the time, I had no idea where it went, and in a future launch, I thought I saw it in the valley below. I don't know what's going on with the game right now, but I just kind of want to get back into the rocket and get off the surface as fast as I could. After reboarding here, I tried to go into the map mode to plan some stuff out, but I could see here as soon as I went back into the main terrain, I seemed to just jump into the air and fall on my side. Trying this again, it also seemed to just explode, so I went off the surface as fast as I could next time, and this seemed to work. And you can see pretty easily here, starting to burn off the surface, and I finally escaped. And of course, you can see warping away from Pole, and with that, the next target is Bop. I pulled in my orbit a little bit more to match up with Bop. Now, Bop is fairly inclined, so it's kind of hard to get an encounter, but eventually here, I got them to line up pretty well. With just a little bit of tuning, I got myself pretty close to the surface here. With that planned out, started to fly in towards Bop here, and start doing my retrograde burn to land on the surface. This was virtually the same thing as Pole, so I'll speed it up a little bit here, but this time you'll notice I actually didn't clip through the surface. Now, I also reloaded the game, and before this, I think I had the game running for 12 hours, so it wouldn't surprise me if that somehow is factoring into it, but you can see now, once I'm on the surface here, I dropped down my Kerbal and planted the flag. And with that done, just did a little bit of waiting here to get myself lined up with Tylo, and after that, I got myself off Pole's surface. And you can see escape here, and with that, you can see warping away from Pole and starting to get my encounter with Tylo set. Now, once I had that planned out here, I just wanted to wait a little while until eventually they got close together, but I started to run into some problems here. My main fuel ship was accidentally encountering Lathe a lot, and then it get flinged out of the Joule system. This was super annoying, and I was kind of getting tired of avoiding it, so instead, I decided to swap over to it here, and my new plan was to try to get captured by Lathe. I just figured I could make that my next target here, and with everything set up here, I started to do my burn and got myself right into Lathe's atmosphere. Now, once I had that set here, I warped in towards Joule, but it didn't occur to me that by trying to get an encounter with Lathe, I accidentally set myself into Joule's atmosphere, and that sort of was the end of that. So with one reload here, I got myself into a slightly better position and warped right in towards Lathe. Now, planning for aerobraking here, I retracted my solar panels and started to face retrograde. With that, I started to burn right near the periapsis, and once I was in the atmosphere, I started to let it go. This seemed to be going well at first, up until I realized I forgot to retract the antennas, and then they exploded. Now, that is gonna necessitate that I try this again, but I also kind of was curious to see if this would work at all, so I continued to burn up in the atmosphere here and pull in my orbit quite a bit. This seemed to be fine, and you can see now I fully got captured. So with that proved here, I remembered to retract the antennas next time and gave it another try. Now, at first, I thought this was gonna go perfectly fine, and in fact, I wasn't even gonna include this in the video, but for whatever reason this time, the main fuel tank decided to explode, and everything just fell apart. So with one more try, I did literally nothing different, but slowed myself down tiny bit more, and this seemed to make all the difference, and I fully got captured pretty comfortably. And after escaping the atmosphere on the other side here, it's time to wrap around to the apoapsis and push out my orbit right above the atmosphere. Once I got that above 50,000 meters here, I switched over to the lander ship again, and now that the other ship was totally safe in Lathe's orbit, it was time to get myself a Tylo encounter. Now, I could see that this lander had about 1,300 meters per second left, which was pretty good, and I was hoping it was enough to get into Lathe's orbit. To help it out a bit though, this Tylo encounter should get it in quite a bit and be pretty fuel efficient. But you can see now warping in towards Joule and over towards Tylo. And after finishing that flyby here, I could see that I already had a Lathe encounter fully ready to go. go. So I just tuned it up here and got myself to scrape right into the atmosphere. And once I got that where I wanted to be, I retracted the landing legs and closed up the docking port on top. And now getting into the atmosphere, I started to do a small burn to limit my speed a tiny bit. And after burning up for a long time here, I got myself fully captured. And with that, really all I had left to do at this point was align the two ships. So I got myself further into the atmosphere to hopefully slow down a lot more. Unfortunately though, I actually slowed down too much on this one and it seemed to dip in too far because I was pulling into my orbit way past where I needed to. So I tried again here and this time I didn't go in quite as far and that seemed to solve the problem. Now I almost got these perfectly aligned with each other, so I was super happy with what I saw there, but I warped up to the apoapsis and pushed out my orbit a tiny bit to make sure I was going to be out of the atmosphere. And with that, it was just a very long waiting game here to finally get these ships aligned. Once I got something reasonably close here, I used a maneuver node to get them within a kilometer of each other, and I'll save you all the details, but you can see now me finally getting them connected. I didn't perfectly get it, so there's a small bounce, but without too much trouble here, they did seem to connect, and I started to transfer in some monopropellant. This is like a redock of the ship once I got off Lathe, and after that, I transferred in a massive amount of fuel, and fully fueled up here, I undocked the ships, and it was time to start landing on Lathe. This was one of the hardest parts of the mission, because Lathe is such a massive water world. Finding an actual piece of land to land on is genuinely difficult. My first idea here though is just to dip into the atmosphere and do a quick dive in to limit my speed. Once I did that, I warped around one more time here, and the second dip in the atmosphere was hopefully going to be the final one. Now going in a bit further here, you can see I finally got captured by Lathe, and I was hoping I was going to be over land. It wasn't looking too good though, and I could see that there was pretty much nothing below me but water. Now worse yet, I accidentally cut my parachutes way too early, and they got immediately destroyed. So this time I tried pulling in the orbit to 35,000 meters, and I wanted to give this a try. This one didn't seem to get me anywhere near land, but at the very least here, I did slow down quite a bit, so it looked like it was gonna be okay. Now I tried again here at 43,000 meters, and this was very close. There's a bunch of land in front of me, but I managed to just barely miss it. Now I also slowed down way more than I've done in the past, and with this, I actually got the parachutes to deploy, and they seemed to do their job. So I gave it one more attempt here, slightly further up above the atmosphere than before, and with this, it was time to go for my final landing. I was fairly confident at this point that I was going to be over the land, and you can see now, it did seem to work out. Now around 6,000 meters here, I was being very careful and started to burn my main engines. This is to get me below 300 meters per second, and that allowed my parachutes to deploy here and started to slow me down. I'm not entirely sure why I deployed my parachute so late here, but it seemed to work out fine, and now I was going for the final descent. Unfortunately though, I forgot to fire my engines at the last second, and I was going a little too fast. Easily enough though, just reloaded the save here, and you can see now I slowed down to the last second and actually managed to touch down. After that, you can see here I warped today, got my Kerbal out, and started to plant the flag. My ship was kind of running away though, so I very quickly got back in it, time warped, and started to fly away. This ascent was going to be one of the hardest of the entire mission, probably except for the main one off Kerbin. The reason for that is that I have barely enough fuel to get off Lathe here, and my lander was specifically designed around the fact that it needed to get off of here. Now, once I pushed my apoapsis out of the atmosphere here, I just had to wait a little while until eventually I got all the way up there. And once I finally did, you can see me extending out my orbit again, and I was hoping I was finally gonna circularize. Fortunately, it did seem like I had enough fuel, and after not too much time here, you can see my periapsis appear on the other side. And with a tiny bit more nudging, I got it all the way circularized, and with that, I was finally in orbit. The best part was probably that I had 174 meters per second of delta V left, which means that I could save a ton of fuel by not pulling in my fueler ship. Now I switched back over to the fueler ship next, and after that, I started to do some aero braking to get myself aligned with the lander. For whatever reason, I did a lot more tumbling this time, but after one pass through the atmosphere, I extended out my orbit a bit, and I got these to line up almost perfectly. Now, without too much waiting here, you can see I got them touched together, and with that, I finally finished my Lathe landing. Now, I transferred in some fuel into the lander again, and after that, it was time to launch this entire thing away from Lathe. Unfortunately, when I tried doing this, though, I forgot to deactivate the little lander on top, and it was sort of fighting the big ship. So after a quick reload here, I got everything working again, and with that, I extended out my orbit and finally escaped. Now, my next target here is Val, and Val should be super easy compared to Lathe. It's less massive, expensive and has no water or anything, so pretty much anywhere is a good spot to land. Now, getting in close to Lathe here, I started to prepare for a retrograde burn, and this is where I made probably the biggest mistake of the mission. You'll see here, as I'm burning, I'm pulling in my orbit a lot more than I need to, and this is gonna cost me an insane amount of fuel. Now, checking my main fuel tank here, I could see I only had 356 units of liquid fuel left, and that was gonna be enough for about half of my lander. Now, I undocked my lander here, and the plan was to use as little fuel as possible because I did not have a lot left at all. Now, my first attempt at landing here went about as well as expected. It seemed to always crash into the surface here, but my second try seemed to be considerably better here, and I actually managed to stick the landing. And of course, had to kick out my Kerbal here and plant my flag. With that done, got back in the lander and started to extend out my orbit. And next up, just extended it out to dock up with the main ship, but this is where I was wasting a lot of fuel. I had still about 1,000 meters per second left in the lander, which means that I easily could have extended this out way to the edge of Val's orbit, and this means that I just have a lot less fuel in the tank than I realistically probably should have. Now, firstly, I drained all the monopropellant since I won't need it at this point, and also I transferred in every last piece of fuel to the fueler ship. Now with that, I undocked these and it was time to get to Tylo. I realized at this point I had about 3,000 meters per second of fuel, which was barely enough to get there. I was a little concerned I was gonna have to reload extremely far back to conserve that tiny bit of fuel, but I decided to just go for it here and go for my Tylo encounter. Now already I was down to like 2,900 after messing around quite a bit, and this was beginning to become extremely concerning. Now getting in towards Tylo here, I got near the surface and around 40,000 meters, I started to do my burn. This was significantly too late though, and Exia just smashed into the surface. I also realized a massive problem though, because I smashed into the surface and I was going 900 meters per second, but I only had 800 meters per second left in my tank. This means that best case scenario, I'm going to always be hitting the surface at least 100 meters per second. Now I was still curious if there's anything I could do here, so I tried burning again, and this time I slowed down a lot closer to the surface. I ran out of fuel though, and I was going about 200 meters per second, and that was about the end of that. Giving it another try, I managed to slow down to about 180, and the crew capsule survived for a while, but after skidding across the surface, it eventually just exploded. Now I even tried EVAing the Kerbal to see if that would help at all, but unfortunately they always seem to hit the surface and just kind of explode. A few more tries later, I tried rotating to slow myself down more, which helped out a lot, but even this was too much for the Kerbal, and they kind of just perished. I had one last idea though, and that's as I was trying to land, you'll see the last second I kicked up the ship to vertical. For whatever reason, this seemed to kick off the Kerbal a lot better, and finally here I managed to hit the ground with their feet, and for whatever reason, this seemed to make them okay, and even though they hit the surface at 136 meters per second, they ended up stopping fine here, and with that, I actually managed to do it. Honestly, I didn't really expect to finish out this mission. Usually when I plan out these sorts of videos, I have a goal in mind that usually gets pulled back a little bit as I realize things are kind of extremely difficult. This one though, every step of the way seemed to still prove itself as possible, and I'm so glad I genuinely managed to do it. But if you guys have any suggestions for future videos, make sure to leave down in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and otherwise, till next time.